So in terms of Vietnam, here is the entire map of both North and South Vietnam. This is the border, okay? And this is the country of Laos, and this is Cambodia, which are neighboring. The red line that runs down here into Cambodia, Laos, and then these arrows that extend into South Vietnam, this is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. View the video posted about that to see its significance and importance. The thing to know of that is that this is an obvious lifeline and supply line for the North Vietnamese army as they would encroach into South Vietnam, but also a supply line for the Viet Cong, who were the guerrilla group that was fighting in here. This is Hamburger Hill, okay, a small hill in the Da Nang Valley that proved to be a pretty brutal place to be. So Hamburger Hill was only seen as a strategic location because it was located in the valley through what they knew to be the Ho Chi Minh Trail as it fed through into the Da Nang Valley. Now, this hill was a fortress, I guess, of the North Vietnamese army. As they would come from Laos, they would supply this hill. Okay? So, as in almost every U.S. battle in Vietnam, in what was called seek and destroy, the U.S. Would find evidence of where the Viet Cong or the Vietnamese army was, the NVA, and they would helicopter in, okay, because they couldn't walk there. It's very, very thick jungle, so walking was out of the question. So the helicopter became the most vital tool of Vietnam, which is why if you're watching any Vietnam movie or footage or anything like that, helicopters are going to be a big part of it. They would come in through these helicopters, they would find a landing zone, and then they would go and find the enemy. In this case, they knew exactly where the enemy was, which was not something they were normally used to. So that gave them a location of where they had to go. But in that case, it also made it very difficult for them to gain any ground up Hamburger Hill. As you could imagine, fighting uphill was very, very hard. Now, in terms of the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, these little boxes here are meant to symbolize is the underground passageways that the NVA had spent years building and developing. So, thing to know about the Vietnam War is that the North Vietnamese were well prepared. I mean, they had spent 10 years fighting the French and knew that likelihood of the Americans coming was very possible. So for years, not just in Hamburger Hill by any means, but across South Vietnam and through because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which they also had to build in preparation for this war, they were able to launch an attack through their own tunnels that they would be able to get access through, continually supply each other through, and then reinforce themselves throughout this entire war. This is significant. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is significant because Laos and Cambodia are two sovereign nations that are not Vietnam. And what was clear was that the U.S. had no intention of invading Cambodia or Laos, despite the fact the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through those countries. This was done deliberately. The North Vietnamese knew that the Americans would not risk a war with Laos or Cambodia to destroy this trail. Now, they did bomb it relentlessly. They must have dropped, thousands of tons of bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail throughout the course of the war daily. And it was a brutal place for any of the North Vietnamese to be. They didn't want to be there, but at the same time, they also knew that it was vital to their war effort, and it was working. Every day that it was bombed, they would rebuild it that day, and that was just part of the process. It was an incredibly effective tool. And it played a huge role in Hamburger Hill. This is one of the reasons they wanted to take this hill, was to cut off one of these supply lines and a major strategic point that was held by the North Vietnamese. The war itself was brutal, but this particular battle was also very brutal in that it was very slow moving as the U.S. troops had to fight their way for every inch through thick jungle uphill to take this position away from the NVA. Now, the U.S. tried to use their superior firepower of artillery from other locations and, of course, bombers and aircraft. Those are the best airplanes I could draw. You're welcome. Non-stop, relentlessly bombing the positions of the North Vietnamese, but it didn't really seem to make a dent. Not to mention, well, they were so well dug in, but as the U.S. moved forward, they were constantly peppered by well-placed and strategically located booby traps. That's right, the Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese armies, both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, would lay these dangerous traps. These are called punjai traps. These are simply bamboo rods stuck into the ground and sharpened with, of course, a false bottom, so a false top. And so a U.S. troop walking over this would fall through and be seriously injured. This is just one of hundreds of different booby trap methods that the NVA would use. And very, very effective, mostly psychologically. Troops of the U.S. Army were constantly terrified of coming across these things. Not to mention, the fighting was so close quarters that often these aircraft and the artillery would injure and kill some of their own people. The battle lasted 10 days. It was a brutal fight, took hundreds of casualties, thousands on the side of the NVA, and the Americans finally took the hill on May 20th. And it was a successful victory for the U.S., who won in a couple of ways. One, they took the strategic location, but they won in body count, which was one of the ways that the war was calculated to be won. The numbers were like 10-1 in terms of casualties, which was very good for the U.S. That's really the only way that they can measure this. However, after taking the hill on May 20th, there became no further need to support it. The truth is, if they tried to hold that hill, likely the NVA would have come back in the coming days and attacked it in force, and they would have ended up having to hold it off at whatever cost. And so, on May 20th, the U.S. decided to abandon the hill shortly after. And so, as the U.S. left the position and left it abandoned, not too surprisingly, the NVA returned only a day later to retake the hill for themselves. And so, Hamburger Hill was a total waste. It didn't end up doing anything aside from creating a note of victory, but who was really victorious? The NVA actually weren't completely destroyed on the hill. They abandoned the hill. They left it and escaped as the Americans took control of it, waited for the Americans to leave, and then simply took it back. So, as you can see, the Battle of Hamburger Hill is just one battle, only 10 days long. It wasn't as significant as, say, some of the other bigger battles of this conflict, or any conflict for that matter, but symbolically it served a really big purpose. The whole thing was being monitored by the media, the American media, and it was constantly sending messages back home in terms of the progress of the battle. And so, as you can imagine, when the public found out later that the hill was simply abandoned and taken back by the Vietnamese, it seemed absolutely wasteful and unnecessary. And that is the Battle of Hamburger Hill. Have a good day.